Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kylie Koeper, and I am joined by our classmates Thomas Jimenez, David Lopez, Jesse Lopez, Patricia Correa, Elaina Reyes, and Coleman Hubert, and we are going to talk to you all today about Bell Chapter 8, Performing Resistance. So let's jump right into it. Theory and perspective. How can performance change the world? So Aristotle separated rhetoric, which is the art of persuasion essential to lively and effective public debate, from poetics, the art of fictive storytelling through dramatic and epic forms. So while rhetoric is practical and useful art, poetics is considered a fine art that is intended to delight through imitation. Moving on to theories of performing resistance in 3 different sites. The first site involving theories that challenge Aristotelian poetics of dramatic form, conflict, action, and resolution through catharsis. The second direction involves theories that demonstrate how Aristotelian notions and terminology are alive and well when people take to the streets in media accounts for political action. And the third direction involving new conceptions of power felt and enacted in everyday life. Now, from Aristotle to postmodernism, Herbert Marcuse says, "Art cannot change the world, but it can contribute to changing the consciousness and drives of the men and women who would change the world." So Robert Corrigan traces 3 profound shifts in notions of dramatic form that are helpful in understanding the relationship of the stage to resistance. That first shift in notion would be the most important part of Aristotelian drama is the predictable unfolding of the plot, so the beginning, middle, and end, as revealed in the action, the choices, and the discoveries of the protagonist. The second shift would be modernist form, so an emphasis on plot and action that is replaced by consciousness. And lastly, postmodernism, so the radical rejection of a whole self that is knowledgeable truth as obtainable and language as referential. Bertolt Brecht was a political philosopher who rejected realism in acting and Aristotelian dramatic form in playwriting. He argued that theater can be a forum for social and ideological change by creating new forms and new worlds. He was committed to Marxism as a political philosophy and sought to make theater a place of didact teaching about history, power, and social conditions. He had 3 radical concerns, the first being attention to dialects and contradictions in social relations, especially class conflict. Secondly, commitment to staging and acting techniques that refuse to engage in mimetic representation. And lastly, the production of audiences who are critical observers moved to enact social and political change. For Brecht, a play or performance is not here and now, but there and then, a constructed, though powerful, look at life and the world. Brecht termed this new type of performance epic theater and contrasted it with dramatic theater. So dramatic theater works to create a reality that unfolds before eyes and to generate emotional identification between audiences and performers, while epic theater works to create a critical distance among the world of performance, the performers, and the audiences. Here we have Table 8.1, Dramatic and Epic Theater. It can be found on page 4 of Bell Chapter 8, and this breaks down the difference between dramatic theater plot and epic theater narrative. And for the sake of time, we urge that you just screenshot this slide to save for your notes. Moving on to Brecht's techniques. He proposed several techniques, all designed to create critical distance through alienation effects. So that first technique being breaking the 4th wall, where performers will break the 4th wall between themselves and the audience when they address the audience directly, making observers aware they are being watched and that performers in turn are watching their own behavior. The second technique being keeping emotions in check. This is where performers will separate themselves from the characters they play by keeping their emotions in check and working to stay emotionally detached in performance. This is not to say the performance is void of emotion, but rather that the performer and the character do not become one.
Continuing on with Brecht's distance techniques and the notion of letting the seams of a performance show, let's look at arresting moments. So this technique is used to interrupt and comment on the unfolding action through technical effects and language effects, like addressing in third person or through stage directions, just to name a few. And an example from the book is Jack's apartment from the movie Fight Club, where his apartment is presented like an IKEA catalog along with the price tags to make a comment about capitalism and consumerism. Another technique, making strange. This technique is used in theater to have a more heightened experience, and it achieves it through juxtaposition, style, and genre. A good example is the 1996 remake of Romeo and Juliet. So the movie is presented in a modern version where swords are replaced with guns and gangs, but the script itself remains in Elizabethan verse. So we can see how Brecht's techniques were meant to look at real life with critical lens, and some of the best examples can be seen in courtrooms with Rodney King, for example. The defense attorneys broke down video evidence to step away from emotional aspects of brutality and help spectators view the footage, some might say more critically. While this aspect was successful, Brecht didn't quite achieve his goal of resistant performance. So let's move on to Augusto Boal. So Boal, he refined Brecht's techniques after years of him fighting for democracy in Brazil, where he focused on action self, which motivates the spectator to take action. We'll be looking at a few of Boal's theater techniques, and I'll start us off with simultaneous dramaturgy. This theater technique, performers will perform a scene on an important topic and then stop and ask the audience for suggestions at the climax of the scene. At this point, performers will improvise the solutions brought forth by the audience, and later, audience members can also criticize and intervene the performance. This is really helpful in tearing down that wall between performers and spectators, because whoever is watching is no longer just sitting back and watching the inevitable run of the show. It's not just predetermined anymore because spectators actually have a say.
And now we will look at types of theater. A type of theater is the image theater, in which spectators become part of the performance. This is done when the real image becomes the ideal image through a transitional image. This is further better explained through an example. An example is with feminist performance works. One type is when Karen Finlay showed the transformation of her actual nude body to that of an ideal woman as she layers on raw eggs, glitter, confetti, and garlands to form a movable evening gown. The final result is a body that is both seductive and repellent, a constructed and impossible object. And this was done to counteract objectifying images of women's body as real, ideal, and transformative. Now we will move on to the invisible theater. In this kind, participants take the play to a place which is not a theater, and they perform it for an audience who is not aware of what is actually going on, and they are transformed into protagonists without them knowing. So, an example of this is when performers were talking about prejudice against foreigners while dining at Swedish restaurants, and they would note how the people around them would react. In certain cases, we've had other examples where the play appears so real that even police officers show up on the scene and they don't know how to differentiate between the actors and the audience members. And now we will talk about forum theater. In this kind, audiences are aware and they are conscious players in the action. They are aware of the play's purpose and they know their role. Their role is to participate and to change the dramatic outcome in the play. So, how does this work? This is a story that starts off with a political or social problem. One member is the Joker and presents a scene along with a proposed solution to the problem. Then he or she asks the audience whether they agree or they disagree with the solution. and the audience has the option to hop in and replace the actors to take the play in a different direction in case it starts going in a direction that they don't like. And this kind of active theater is used in prisons, police academies, refugee populations as well. And it's used to show how individuals can function in different kinds of relationships and scenarios. And now we're going to transition to a new topic, which is models of protest. So, the 19th century offered something called crowd theory, in which protests were perceived as irregular and irrational. And the one of the points was that crowds are prone to violence and are deviant and abnormal. But then, with mid 20th century came new alternatives, and these alternatives focused on rationalist theories of collective action, knowledgeable choices, game theory, and strategic interactions. And these were used to analyze individual motivations on a more advanced level within protest movements, trade associations, and diplomacy. And as we travel further in time, we are brought to the late 20th century, which brought mobilization paradigm. So, protest was now seen as a regular part of politics, and protesters were seen as normal people pursuing reasonable goals, and economic resources could be tied to protesters' success. With this model, there was a focus on petitions, direct mail campaigns, and fundraising. Then, during this time era, there was also a, a topic called political process, which focused on strategies of groups excluded from and oppressed by political processes. And for these people, protest became an important political opportunity when in the past it had not maybe been that much.
So I will begin talking about public events through an Aristotle lens. So in this section, it discusses the four ways public events are theatricalized. So the first is being that the event must be significant enough to have a negative effect or impact on the public. The second is the event must attract immediate attention. So this can be in the form of news or the radio. The third being the event must come in a recognizable form, such as a ceremony, game, or ritual. And last, the event must be publicized through everyday life. The second section, Carnival and Protest, it starts with a couple definitions. So as the textbook defines, carnival involves the state and church sanctioned disruption of ordinary lives. So what this means is that carnival unmasks the hierarchies of powers in a creative manner. So some examples of this include Mardi Gras or medieval Europe. So this is used to show the uneven distribution of power, but after the carnival is done, people go back to the status quo. And the second definition, carnivalesque protest, is it carries ludic, meaning play elements of culture into the political arena. What this means is that it has like a different agenda for it. And then not everyone understands the reason for carnivalesque protest because it does cause a spectacle. So people do this to cause a scene by running the streets in costumes for a certain purpose. And the last section, from traditional to radical dramaturgy. Dramaturgy is the composition or writing of a play, attending to and shaping the rise and fall of dramatic action, the creation of characters in dialogue, and then mounting this play on the stage in spectacle, voice, and song and diction. So there's the definition, and how that is used is political organizations use this concept to create publicity. So, an example of this would be the anti abortion group Operation Rescue. This tactic is applied when they have people with signs saying rude things to women entering a clinic, and they are doing this to cause a dramatic moment, and it causes a spectacle.
Now we're going to be moving on to Foucault's productive power. And first we're going to talk about Foucault's 5 traditional understandings of power. The first one being power is something that is acquired, seized, shared, held, or lost. Power is enforced by prohibitions, laws, and taboos. Power divides people into rulers and ruled. It flows from the top down to the bottom. Power is located in specific groups, headquarters, or case. Power is oppressive and a model of power over others as a right to control others. Some big points here is that power can be acquired. And for example, a monarch can acquire power by literally being born into it. He can share that power with his wife, with his kids. He can also lose that power. For example, the American Revolution taking over the colonies, and in conclusion, the King of England loses power over the colonies. Power is enforced by laws. If you break a law, then there's going to be a consequence. Power divides people into rulers. You can't have a ruler without people being ruled, just like you can't be ruled without there being a ruler. Power is located in specific groups or headquarters, so groups such as the police or judges in this scenario. Police have the power to make sure people are following the law, and judges have the power to put people in prison or to let people walk. And power is oppressive. Power over others is a right to control others, meaning that a lot of people who have power over others think they can control others. Now we're going to be moving on to the 2 types of power, repressive and productive. Repressive power is the power to silence, wound, and punish. As citizens, we fear this potential power. And an example of this would be back in the Middle Ages when people would be hung in public. And this would basically be a message saying, don't break the law or this will happen to you. But now we're moving towards productive power, which according to Foucault, he argues that power operates not by right, but by technique, and not by law, but by normalization, and not by punishment, but by control. Foucault's theory on power includes that he believed the West moved from a public spectacle of discipline and punishment, which, for example, like I've said earlier, is public hangings, to techniques such as self-discipline and self-surveillance from the idea of developing a prison. Normalization in society refers to our social place, gender, and race, our social positions, and consequences to our social acts. So normalization is basically just how we normalize with laws and in today's world, how we see how things should be ran or consequences. So for example, if I were to go speeding on the highway, I would most likely be pulled over for that and get a ticket. And since I know that will most likely happen, I won't be speeding. That's a sense of normalization in our society. Productive power produces. It produces resistance, relationships, discourses, and people. For example, prisons help produce power by labeling people as criminals because criminals go there. No one wants to go to prison because that's not our reality we want to be in. Therefore, a prison being there creates power, produces power because no one wants to go there. So you're not going to break the law because you don't want to be in prison. So that's sort of a production of power. Next, we're going to be moving on to Foucault's 5 understandings of productive power. 1, power is exercised from the innumerable points of interplay. These are mobile, changing every day, and changeable. Power is produced within and among relationships, social relationships, sexual relationships, and economic relationships. Power runs through the social body as a whole, such as families, groups, and institutions. Power relations are intentional, but there is no one person or place who invented them. Where there is power, there is resistance. And where I really want to get at is where there is power, there is resistance. Because in every single one of these situations, there's power in one of these, and there's resistance in the other. So, for example, we could use a school. School has a ton of rules, and since you don't want to break those rules because there's disciplines, there's resistance to breaking those rules. And we'll get into this in the next slide right here. So how do techniques of prison discipline relate to discipline in the classroom? Prison discipline, cells are arranged to keep everyone under surveillance. There are rigid schedules. Any sort of infraction involves a punishment within the system. And this really relates to school discipline because just as cells are arranged to keep everyone under surveillance, desks are also arranged to have teachers assign them seats and to keep students in their desks, in their place, really. And there are appointed times for certain classes, lunches, breaks, and recesses throughout the entire school, from elementary to middle school to high school to even college. Um, there are set times to keep people in place, to keep things in order, to have responsibilities for people. And lastly, there are rules within schools just like there are rules within prisons. If you break those rules, there will be disciplinary actions. Examples of these are suspensions, expulsions, and so there is resistance here as well, because if you're going to break any of those rules, then you will be having those disciplinary actions towards you. Therefore, you're not going to break those rules, so you don't have those disciplinary actions towards you, and that's where the resistance comes in. You're going to resist breaking any of those rules. All right, perfect. Now we're going to be moving on to the next slide.
In analyzing protest events, Bas Kershaw from 1997 proposed that popular forms of protest should be seen as indulged, which means like examples of would be flash mobs, marches, and peace camps. By making use of the sounds and smell and touch and arrangement of the bodies, it grants this kind of spectacle that can challenge the system of authority on its own terms, with its idea of how it sees things like ceremonies and rituals. This is made with the intent of exposing the illusion of power held by the state. One example, or one foreign quality when analyzing contemporary protests would be the rich exchange between symbolic action and socio-political action. This exchange does not have the intent of shutting down any goals for change, but brings to the table the idea of constantly reinterpreting events and their political potential. An example could be how members associated with PETA would spray paint people wearing fur coats. Another example would be how, during the infamous protests at the Tiananmen Square in 1989, protesters had created a statue similar to that of the Statue of Liberty to protest the acts of the communist leaders to plead to the requests. Another important quality would be events are shaped by spontaneity and set scripts. By using the spontaneous nature of some protests and assuming how much attention that can be acquired, contemporary protests can gain reflexive opportunities for everyone. This can help garner attention to the social political context that gave motivation to people protesting. An instance would be a protest that Iraqi war during August, a slow period for the news. It usually did not get much attention, but with the planned date, it can even get global attention. Another important quality would be events are most often experienced through the representation of the media. In some instances, the people orchestrating the protests may include some certain elements within the mind, the inclusion of the cameras or people documenting them. The media will then choose the highlights of the protest as the focus of the protest to show to everyone. A famous example is a man sitting in front of the platoon of tanks from Tiananmen Square. The last important quality when analyzing contemporary protests would be these events are heavily relied on the organization and planning. Usually when dealing with a great number of people, organization and planning is key success. Any miscalculations or even errors can result in the contemporary protest not to be properly given out the message or even fail to catch any attention from the mass. So it's almost imperative to follow a script in these situations. Although organization is important, the idea of the unexpected and surprising is something that is usually seen, but is found often in the potential of violence happening in a protest. Now moving on to the performing body. Throughout history, social movements involve bodies of real people that are often characterized as mobs, that brought potential for violence that was characterized as a volcano. Mob action is considered purely spontaneous and lacking in form or technique, Susan Lane Foster said in 2003. She argued with this characterization and questioned individuals to find the motive and understanding of why people were part of such protests. Foster brings into play three important U.S. social movements that displayed similarities regarding the bodies of people. The three were the lunch counter sit-ins of the 1960s, the ACT UP die-ins of the late 1980s, and regarding the unresponsiveness of AIDS, and the World Trade Organization political protests in 1999. The similar traits were: one was the ordinary people were acting without a clear, identifiable leader. Second was that these protesters utilized the use of public spaces in strategic and symbolic ways. And thirdly, acted in planned tactics of nonviolence that was rehearsed. With the three similarities the movement shared, their approach to media to represent their agendas were not the same at all. During the sit-ins of the 1960s, hundreds of Black Americans sat at white-only lunch counters throughout the southern states to push the idea of how not out of place it was for people with different colors to be together. To push this action, many of them were practiced and trained to take in a variety of likely outcomes, such as beatings, and to specifically not strike back. By using the media, they were able to use the images, records, and film the media had gotten to showcase the reality and hope to change the attitudes of white Americans. Moving on to for the act of protest, many were angry for the ignorance of the U.S. government on the rise of deaths from AIDS. This protest required careful locations to show powerful messages and chose places like Wall Street and in front of the headquarters of major drug companies. They showcased the rise in deaths by training participants on dying in piles of bodies and outlining them in chalk with statistics of the fatalities. By inviting the media outlets, they knew they were able to show powerful images that would help shape public opinion to their agenda. And by doing so, the media was able to create reality. And then moving on to the World Trade Organization protest that was held in Seattle was one with most notable traits that were different from the other protests. It had gone on for 4 days and it involved diverse groups such as environmentalists, organized labor and immigrant rights activists, and as well as nuclear proliferation protesters that are all employed their own way protesting, but were all still nonviolent acts. With the fear and expectancy of the media being controlled by these companies, they went through a different way of showing their protest to the world by involving themselves in the world of the internet. With live streams, dedicated media accounts, and video photographic accounts, the internet provided for them and to many others many different realities outside the mainstream media. Whenever an individual chooses to participate in these kind of political protests, they commit to whatever physical action to help bring their idea across.
Awesome. So now we're going to talk about the two strategies and tactics. And he defines strategy as like an institutionally structured power, roles, and regulations of institutions, governments, and organizations. Now, just based off this kind of definition, I really want to point out the three words institutions, governments, and organizations. Because with these three words come a pretty heavy connotation in regards to money, power, and lawmaking, which is often much of the things that performers seek to resist. And we're going to talk about his tactics and strategies. So for tactics, he defines those as bodily practices of real people that create space in between, around, and through these structures, rules, and regulations. And one way of doing so that he really puts an emphasis on is being able to improvise. In regards to performing resistance, you want to be able to be difficult to predict in advance. You don't want people to know what you're going to do or how you're going to do it. It's better to come as a shock and better to catch people off guard and display your performance rather than have it planned and have everyone know that it's going to happen. It just kind of lessens the impact that it may have. And he discusses poaching, which is a practice that involves taking enough from the dominant to slip under the radar screen, using the dominant against the dominant without actually challenging the status quo. And one thing that I kind of immediately took away with this was there's a common saying, it's break the system from the inside, and that's maybe get a government job just to see how the government really works, so later in your career you can kind of try and debate and argue and refute what they are actually doing and have a better understanding and a resume to do so. And then there's the art of making do. I know there's two different examples in the textbook. There's one of the African American man who has to live in London in low income housing. Just that's the system that they have. But in doing so, he's actually able to get a sense of clarity and plurality and creativity, which he can use in the future that can benefit him. And then really a big takeaway of the art of making do that I got was the ability to make choices. Everyone can make choices in this life. And then they used the flight attendants example. And they have a lot of choices they can make. Like if someone's too drunk on a plane, they could water down their drinks if they order more. It's simply the art of making choices that can benefit you in the future. And then the section Rethinking Resistance is kind of a way of just, let's take a look at the lens in which we view resistance and see what can be changed as time progresses. And there's a big emphasis on spectacle, and this is a direct quote: "If representational visibility equals power, then almost naked young white women should be running Western culture." And this just goes to show that what we see in society is often the exact opposite of what we like see in the people that run society. We see politicians and leaders, which are in Western culture are mostly white males that are wealthy and come from a upper class. But in reality, what we see is not this at all. They use the words almost naked young white woman should be running Western culture, and they're not far off with that at all. Performance theorists and practitioners continue to utilize successful techniques of the past, but admit that we must alter performances with current times. And this just goes being able to improvise as time goes on, different aspects change, social norms change, being able to adjust and keep your performances of resistance in an improvisational form will be key. And another key is being able to being able to be rational. It can help move audiences. They are crucial pieces of performances, especially when you have a resistance performance. Many of the settings may be not expecting to have a performance like the ones that are about to be displayed, but being able to be rational about it will be really key. And then another critique on Foucault is that he's critiqued by feminists for the lack of attention to gender. And then in the rethinking resistance section, the metaphor of carnival is heavily focused on, and then for 3 reasons: that the carnival always ends, returning to the status quo of social and political inequities, like it just goes back to normal. However, the risks that performers have taken may not. We see it in protests that people get arrested. I know there's a case in Slow actually just recently with the Black Lives Matter movement where someone, like leaders of the protest, got arrested for what many people think is unjust, just because of the case built against them. Whereas her life didn't go back to normal, but it's sad to say that we are still facing many of the problems that the BLM movement tried to prove. And then we got while festive street performance is a display of communal strength and a means of educating the public, no policy or law or budget will be changed unless state feels threatened. It just kind of goes to the comfort zone. We really got to change the comfort zone of people in order for things to actually change in this world. And then the third critique is that women have been real victims of licensed debauchery and lewdness, such as rape and physical abuse, raising the question, whose pleasure is being enabled and valorized in real practices of carnival? So questions that still remain in performance theory is, if the goal of performance resistance is political effectiveness, then how can one measure this? There's really no quantitative value that you can put on it. Maybe there is a qualitative value, but just something to think about. And then the second question is performance a helpful lens for understanding resistance when real blood is shed and real lives are lost? Thank you for listening to this performance today, and we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.